When we think about winter in the Middle Ages or in classical rural Europe, whether in the highlands of France, the cold plains of Poland, or the rugged countryside of Italy, we must understand one simple truth: the peasantry had no modern comforts. No central heating, no insulated windows, and certainly no thermal underwear. Their survival during the harshest months of the year wasn't a matter of luxury, but of cunning, resourcefulness, and ancient traditions passed down through generations. Peasants lived close to the land, close to their animals, and closer still to the harsh realities of nature. Winter in medieval and classical times could be brutal. The coldest nights, especially from December to early March, brought biting winds, frost-covered fields, and bone-chilling silence to rural communities. Temperatures would dip well below freezing, and yet, these peasants, often malnourished, poorly clothed, and living in simple wooden or mud structures, found ways to endure. Their secrets? Layering, community warmth, clever construction, and, surprisingly, their livestock. Let's start with the peasant house itself. It was never just a home. In many parts of Europe, especially in northern climates, a peasant's house was part living space, part barn. These multi-use structures, sometimes called longhouses, in northern Europe, had a space for the family on one end and for animals, cows, pigs, goats, on the other. And while this might sound unsanitary by today's standards, the heat produced by animals was one of the most crucial sources of warmth during the winter nights. A single cow can generate the same heat as a small space heater. When kept in close quarters, the warmth from animals and humans together created a microclimate that kept the frost at bay. The walls of these houses were often made of wattle and daub, a technique using woven wooden strips covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. While this might not sound sturdy, it had excellent insulating properties. The thatched roofs also played an important role. Thickly layered straw not only kept rain out, but also helped trap heat inside. And even though there was no glass in windows, wooden shutters and fabric coverings were used to minimize drafts. Inside, the hearth was the heart of the home. A constantly burning fire wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. The fire provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Firewood, however, was not always abundant or easy to gather, especially in regions where forests were owned by landlords or kings. Peasants learned to burn everything they could: dry dung, peat, and even old thatch. They carefully rationed wood, only using large fires during the coldest parts of the day, often letting embers glow slowly through the night to conserve resources. Clothing, too, played a crucial role in peasant survival. Contrary to popular belief, they didn't only wear rags. Wool was the fabric of choice, thick, naturally insulating, and widely available. Peasants layered their garments: tunics over shirts, cloaks over tunics, wool socks or wrappings on their feet, and even stuffed straw into their boots or shoes for extra insulation. Hoods and hats were common, since most heat is lost through the head. Gloves and mittens, made from felted wool or rough leather, were handmade and cherished. Sleep was strategic. Most peasant families shared a single bed, or slept side by side on straw mattresses, or furs laid over the floor. Sharing body heat was not just about affection, it was a practical, life-saving habit. Children slept with their parents, and older family members were kept close to the fire. In colder climates, some households practiced a form of segmented sleep, waking in the middle of the night to tend the fire, pray, or talk before returning to rest. Another key aspect of winter survival was food. Not only was it important for nutrition, but for warmth. Peasants relied heavily on root vegetables, grains, legumes, and preserved foods. Meat was rare but highly prized during winter for the calories it provided. Thick stews, porridge, and bread formed the bulk of the winter diet. Alcoholic drinks like ale and mulled wine helped create a sense of warmth, even if they didn't truly increase body temperature. But survival wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. Festivals like Yule, the 12 Days of Christmas, or other local winter rites offered spiritual and emotional relief. Songs, stories, games, and gatherings helped communities cope with the darkness and isolation. Faith played a role too. The church taught that enduring hardship on earth brought one closer to heaven. This gave meaning to their suffering and helped peasants endure it with surprising grace. Even within poverty and simplicity, peasants developed ingenious customs. For instance, some hung thick tapestries or even spare garments over the walls to trap heat. Others filled cracks with moss or clay. Some communities built earth homes partially sunk into the ground to take advantage of natural insulation. These were not people of science, but they were people of adaptation. In a time when death from cold, hunger, or illness was a real threat, the peasants' relationship with winter was a delicate dance between fear and familiarity. Each family had its own rhythm: rise with the dim light, tend the animals, gather in the warmth of the hearth, sleep together tightly packed. Winter was not a passing inconvenience. It was a season of life, and learning to live with it was part of the peasant's very identity. While individual strategies, like layering wool or sleeping beside the animals, were essential for surviving the cold, there was another powerful force working to keep classical peasants alive during the cruelest months of winter: the community. In peasant life, isolation often meant death. But together, peasants formed tightly woven social fabrics that were, in many ways, more reliable than any single hearth or cloak. First, there was the practice of mutual aid. This was not charity, it was survival. Neighbors exchanged goods, shared firewood, and took turns watching the sick or elderly. In small rural villages, it was common for families to rotate responsibilities, like checking on an elderly widow or distributing excess stew to a sick household. In return, those same households would share their surplus when others fell into misfortune. This kind of reciprocal care wasn't just morally upheld, it was woven into the rhythms of village life, especially during winter, when isolation could kill. One of the most fascinating, yet often overlooked, aspects of wintertime peasant survival was the importance of oral knowledge. Today we rely on thermostats and modern medicine, but back then, survival was guided by stories, wisdom, and old remedies. Many peasant households had a handful of traditional cures passed down through generations: herbal teas, warm stones, fermented mixtures, and poultices made from boiled bark or moss. For example, hot infusions of elderberry or thyme were believed to treat coughs and keep fevers at bay. They didn't always work, but sometimes they did, and belief in their power brought comfort, which mattered just as much. The role of animals, too, was more complex than just warmth. In many cases, peasants relied on animal behaviors to signal weather changes. Dogs howling or chickens huddling were considered signs of an approaching storm. Cows refusing to eat could predict a deep frost. Over time, this observational knowledge became part of a shared winter lore that guided preparation and behavior. But there was also a sacred dimension to all of this. Winter was not just physical, it was mystical. For many peasants, particularly those in areas where pre-Christian traditions lingered, the long nights were filled with omens and rituals. The winter solstice, the darkest night of the year, was treated with awe. In some cultures, peasants believed that spirits roamed freely on bitter nights. Doors were barred not just against the cold, but against things unseen. Candles were lit in windows to protect the home, and bundles of herbs were burned to cleanse the air and keep sickness out. These weren't just superstitions, they were mental defenses against despair. Winter was a time when hunger crept in like a thief. Crops were long harvested, food stores slowly dwindling, and livestock had to be rationed. Some families slaughtered pigs or sheep in late autumn and preserved the meat through salting, drying, or smoking. The arrival of winter meant months of carefully measured portions, relying on what had been prepared months in advance. Storage techniques were crude but effective. Root cellars, dug into the earth, were used to keep turnips, potatoes, and carrots from freezing. Grain was kept in sacks hung from rafters to keep rats away. Cheese, a valuable source of fat and protein, was often aged and kept in cloth or ash to preserve it. Even butter and lard were stored in clay pots or animal bladders. These practices required foresight. A peasant who failed to prepare adequately in summer and autumn might not live to see the spring. On the coldest nights, when frost painted the walls and the stars shimmered above snow-covered fields, the peasant family would retreat inward, physically and spiritually. They told stories, folk tales, religious parables, or legends of winter spirits and noble ancestors. Some stories were warnings, like the tale of the farmer who hoarded food and found rats instead. Others were hopeful, promising that winter, no matter how harsh, would always end. What's especially notable is how little energy was wasted. Peasant life in winter was deliberately slow. Physical movement was minimized to preserve calories. People worked less, slept more, and spent long hours simply sitting by the fire. Children played with hand-carved toys, sang songs, or practiced needlework. Adults mended tools, wove baskets, or quietly prepared for the spring. This seasonal slowing down wasn't laziness. It was a biological necessity. Less food meant less energy, and peasants adapted their pace to match. In some cases, entire villages would share a communal oven or fire pit to save on fuel. On certain days, bread would be baked for multiple families at once. These baking days were social as well as practical, opportunities to catch up on news, offer help, or simply remember that one wasn't alone. Social closeness was a buffer against the cold. Children, often thought to be the most vulnerable, were surprisingly resilient. Peasant children learned early how to care for themselves. They wrapped cloth around their feet, stuffed straw in their shirts, and knew how to find warmth. Older children took on serious roles during winter, collecting dung, feeding animals, carrying water, or gathering firewood. These responsibilities gave them purpose, and purpose helped them endure. In truth, the classical peasant didn't conquer winter. They coexisted with it. They didn't fight the cold so much as bend around it, like reeds in a storm. They adapted their homes, their minds, their traditions. They used everything: light, shadow, earth, smoke, stories, animals, and each other. Their winters weren't cozy, but they were full of meaning. Survival itself became an art, passed from elder to child, carved into memory like names etched on wood. As winter deepened and the coldest nights reached their peak, classical peasants often entered a state of endurance that was not only physical and social, but also profoundly spiritual. This final layer of survival wasn't woven from wool or stored in root cellars. It lived in the mind and the soul. When the winds howled like wolves through the thatch, and the bread grew harder and smaller with each passing week, peasants turned to the only flame that could not be extinguished: faith. Faith was everywhere. It shaped how they saw the cold, the snow, and even death. To the medieval or classical peasant, winter was never just a season, it was a divine test. For Christians, it was a time to remember the suffering of Christ, to bear burdens patiently, and to trust that the frozen earth would one day bloom again. For those still influenced by older pagan beliefs, winter was a liminal time, when the boundaries between the human and the divine were thinner. Either way, the message was clear: hardship had meaning. The local church played a central role in winter survival, far beyond sermons or holy days. Churches were one of the few public places that could offer shelter and warmth to the destitute. Many allowed the poor to sleep near the fire or in the nave during extreme cold spells. Monks and clergy often distributed leftover food donated wool garments, or even invited children to stay overnight in times of extreme weather. The bells of the church served as more than spiritual calls. They also warned of storms, or signaled emergencies in the community. Prayer itself became a kind of nightly ritual. Families knelt together by the dim glow of the hearth, whispering appeals for protection, warmth, and mercy. Some even blessed their doors with holy water or ash, believing it could ward off sickness and frost. While we may think of these actions as superstition, they offered structure and hope. And in the brutal logic of winter, hope could mean survival. Another powerful tradition was the blessing of the home. During Epiphany, chalk was used to mark the doors with sacred symbols, inviting divine protection. These marks lingered through winter, offering psychological safety as much as spiritual. It was a reminder, even in a world of darkness, someone was watching over them. Meanwhile, some peasants turned to folk healers or local wise women, guardians of the old ways. These figures understood not only herbal medicine, but seasonal rhythms. They knew, for example, when to rub goose fat on chests to fight off coughs, or how to steep pine needles to create a tea rich in vitamin C, long before the science was known. They mixed tinctures, lit incense, or performed chants to cleanse the cold. Were these acts magic, medicine, or just belief? To the peasant, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they worked, sometimes in body, always in spirit. As winter dragged into its final weeks, rationing became an art form. Meals were smaller, simpler, and more carefully timed. Peasants learned to chew slowly, to feel full from thick broths and dark bread. Hunger became a familiar companion, and managing it required more than food, it required discipline. Children were taught not to complain. Every morsel had purpose. Every meal was a victory. And yet, winter also gave rise to surprising moments of joy. Carnival, for example, exploded in color and madness just before the Lenten fast began. Even in the heart of winter, peasants found a reason to dance, sing, and laugh, perhaps because it was so rare. Music echoed through cold valleys, masks were worn, and spirits lifted. These festivals didn't just brighten the soul, they reminded people that life, even in hardship, was worth celebrating. Many communities also practiced rituals to call spring forward. In some Germanic and Slavic regions, effigies of winter were built and then burned or drowned in rivers, symbolizing the end of the long, cold death and the return of life. These acts were communal therapy. They allowed peasants to mark progress, to say, "We have made it this far. We will make it further still." By March, the ground was still hard, and snow still fell, but the peasant had survived the core of winter. Skin was chapped. Hands were cracked. Bodies were thinner. But the spirit was intact. Spring would come. It always did. And the lessons learned during those long nights would be passed down like relics. How to bank a fire with ash to keep it glowing. How to stitch a cloak from scraps. How to smile even when your belly is empty. In the end, the peasant didn't just survive winter by accident or brute strength. They did it by mastering a whole system of knowledge. How to live with less, how to rely on others, how to listen to nature, and how to believe, deeply, that the cold would not last forever. Today, wrapped in our heated homes with food on demand, it's easy to forget the daily courage that once defined winter life. But if we listen closely to the past, we hear a whisper from that long-ago hearth. Survival is not just about heat. It's about heart.